My name is Karel Frakapan, and I am UNESCO's focal point on hate speech and combating anti-Semitism through education. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event organized by UNESCO, Neighborhood International, and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue to launch a civil society toolkit designed to facilitate and consolidate the voice of Jewish and human rights organizations in the face of this growing manifestation of hate. Anti-Semitism is on the rise globally, posing a threat to Jewish communities and societies as a whole. It is a threat also to civil society. Jewish organizations, professionals, and young people have been harassed online, threatening their safety and security and infringing on freedom of expression. The popularity of social media has increased young people's encounters with anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, violent extremist narratives, and various forms of hate speech, necessitating new forms of digital citizenship for the internet era. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to reflect on the power of words, the power to stigmatize, dehumanize, and polarize communities and societies, but also their power to bring people together, foster understanding, and build relationships in the most divided societies. Civil society has a critical role to play in responding to anti-Semitism and hate speech through advocacy, education, and research. By working together, including with governments and international organizations, to find solutions to this growing problem. This is why UNESCO partnered with the Neighborhood and ISD to develop this new toolkit for civil society. Only together, we can build a resilient global community that defends human rights and stands up for peaceful coexistence and intercultural understanding. These are the values that are at the core of UNESCO's mission. Without further ado, I have the honor to give the floor to Mrs. Stefania Giannini, UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Education.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be with you today and welcome you to this event that will focus on the important role of civil society in responding to online anti-Semitism and hate speech. UNESCO, as you know, is delighted to cooperate with Neighborhood and the Institute of Strategic Dialogue on the launch of this civil society toolkit. What it's about? It provides an opportunity to establish a set of strategies and activities to support civil society organizations in addressing anti-Semitism and hate speech on social media. Action is urgently needed to mitigate the impact of this type of harmful content and its repercussions: violent extremism, intolerance, discrimination. Anti-Semitism concerns us all. Like any form of hatred, it undermines the values that underpin our societies. We need to work across the board. Governments, social media companies, and civil society must build together partnerships to develop a whole-of-society approach to addressing anti-Semitism. This entails a stronger coordination with groups targeted specifically by hate speech, young people and researchers. Needless to say, we require more transparency and more accountability from social media companies to tackle this hatred. This guide provides also concrete actions for civil societies, notably Jewish organizations, to address the issue while upholding global freedom of expression principles. We must work together, actually, so that the root causes of hate speech are better understood globally. I would like to thank Neighborhood International and the Institute of Strategic Dialogue for their unremitting commitment in these issues. At UNESCO, as you know, we believe education is
There seems to be a little technical problem that we're trying to solve. And I think we will relaunch the video in a few seconds. Thanks for your patience.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be with you today and welcome you to this event that will focus on the important role of civil society in responding to online antisemitism and hate speech. UNESCO, as you know, is delighted to cooperate with B'nai B'rith and the Institute of Strategic Dialogue on the launch of this civil society toolkit. What it's about? It provides an opportunity to establish a set of strategies and activities to support civil society organizations in addressing antisemitism and hate speech on social media. Action is urgently needed to mitigate the impact of this type of harmful content and its repercussions: violent extremism, intolerance, discrimination. Antisemitism concerns us all. Like any form of hatred, it undermines the values that underpin our societies. We need to work across the board. Governments, social media companies, and civil society must build together partnerships to develop a whole-of-society approach to addressing antisemitism. This entails a stronger coordination with groups targeted specifically by hate speech, young people and researchers. Needless to say, we require more transparency and more accountability from social media companies to tackle this hatred. This guide provides also concrete actions for civil societies, notably Jewish organizations, to address the issue while upholding global freedom of expression principles. We must work together, actually, so that the root causes of hate speech are better understood globally. I would like to thank B'nai B'rith International and the Institute of Strategic Dialogue for their unremitting commitment in these issues. At UNESCO, as you know, we believe education is an indispensable investment to build more peaceful, more inclusive, just society for all, and help young people, especially young people, engage in public debate responsibly and reject all forms of hate. UNESCO provides support for decision makers as well, and ministries of education, and trains educators to develop specific intervention aimed and explicitly addressing antisemitism and hate speech at all levels of education. In particular, we supported the training of educators to teach about and prevent antisemitism. Well, civil society played an important role in this kind of activities, particularly in non-formal and informal education. Together, we can help societies become more resilient and engage against antisemitism and persuasive extremism and fear-mongering tactics, such as, for instance, conspiracy theories, disinformation, propaganda, support Jewish communities, and they are targeted by hate. I wish you all fruitful deliberations, and I look forward really to tackling this issue together.
My thanks to Mrs. Giannini for this inspiring welcome to this webinar. I'm pleased now to offer the floor to Mr. Daniel Mariaschen, CEO of B'nai B'rith International.
Thank you, Karel. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to join with Assistant Director General Giannini in welcoming you to today's event. Stefania, thank you for your remarks and the continued work of UNESCO in tackling hate in all its forms, putting education at the heart of your work. B'nai B'rith is privileged to have been a partner of UNESCO for decades to advance many important shared goals. Equally, we are grateful for the new and strengthened partnership with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the breadth of expertise that you bring to the table in tackling some of the most pressing challenges of our time: extremism, disinformation, radicalization, and the accelerated spread of these social ills online. We're pleased that together we can contribute the civil society guide we're launching today to the toolbox of Jewish communities and allies alike to tackle the growing challenge of anti-Semitism online. As digital harm has become ubiquitous in what is increasingly a virtual public square, it is essential that the Jewish community and all vulnerable groups are well equipped to meet the moment and to flourish in new circumstances. The Jewish community is no stranger to adapting to changing, challenging times. At B'nai B'rith, through nearly our 180-year history, we have witnessed and fought the weaponization of communication and the emerging technologies of the day to foment hate and disunity, to cultivate divisions and intolerance, with no more abhorrent manifestation than the proliferation of Nazi propaganda and ideology, the culmination of anti-Jewish hatred. Today, what we hoped had become a permanent taboo, open, vile anti-Semitism, is becoming increasingly commonplace. Extreme nationalists glorify and resuscitate World War II-era fascists. They deny and trivialize the Holocaust and circulate myths of Jewish power and influence. Meanwhile, the left traffics in a form of Holocaust distortion of its own, as Israel's detractors look to portray Israelis as the new Nazis and Jews worldwide as their enablers. Indeed, survey after survey of Jews in the diaspora shows alarming targeting of Jews worldwide with anti-Semitic rhetoric. All this amplified exponentially on social media, but by no means confined to it, as anti-Semitic worldviews circulate online time and again, have violent ramifications in the physical world, from Poway to Paris, from Pittsburgh to Halle, Charlottesville to Buffalo. Consequent recent crises have made more evident the pervasive nature of anti-Semitism through conspiracy theories and the tools of propaganda. The COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating war in Ukraine, atrocious catastrophes of our time, have been hotbeds of anti-Semitic prejudice. And in every anti-Semitic conspiracy laid out to erroneously explain away world events lies not only a threat to Jews, but an unmistakable warning sign for our democracies and for all of our freedoms. As the guide we're launching today reminds us, the opportunities offered by the digital space are endless, and their response to unprecedented global challenges formidable. But we can only reap the benefits of these opportunities if we manage to effectively address the challenges, as the digital environment enables ever faster spread of hate and gives dangerous platforms and microphones to divisiveness. We all, governments, tech companies, civil society, and not least the Jewish community and allies across all sectors, must work collaboratively to build resistance and resilience in the face of these threats. At B'nai B'rith, we're committed to do just that, and we're gratified to have worked with partners at ISD and UNESCO to produce the toolkit at hand. The guide, Anti-Semitism Online, a toolkit for civil society, offers a comprehensive yet easy to understand look at anti-Jewish prejudice online, where it emerges and how it manifests itself. It screens through and evaluates where it emerges and emerging policy responses, enabling the sharing of best practices across borders. And essentially, it provides communities with diverse advocacy avenues, as well as the tools to build resilience within their membership, whether through better reporting mechanisms, victim support, or citizenship education. Our hope is to work with civil society as well as with governments and companies in addressing the multifaceted challenge at hand, with the new toolkit serving as an important building block. All this said, I thank the speakers joining us today who've contributed tremendously to this field to date and look forward to hearing their insights in the discussion to come.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel, for this important message and for the leadership of B'nai B'rith on tackling anti-Semitism online. Today's webinar is split in two panels. The first panel will analyze the nature, the extent, the manifestations of online anti-Semitism. And the second panel will discuss civil society solutions to this issue. I'm pleased to hand the floor over to Herberta von Vos-Wittisch, Executive Director of ISD Germany, who will be moderating the first panel. Herberta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Could you switch on my video? think that might be, here we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our opening panel. Together with our terrific panelists, we will try to lay the base for a joint understanding of the online anti-Semitism threat. My name is Huberta von Voss. I'm the Executive Director of ISD Germany. Together with our colleagues in London, we teamed up with Neighbors International to tackle the rising threat of online anti-Semitism. And we're very glad that we got the opportunity and grateful for the fruitful partnership with UNESCO and also for the funding which came from the German Ministry for Interior. The toolkit, as has been said, looks to build literacy among Jewish professionals, to community members and allies from across society to equip all of us with the necessary knowledge and ideas to take action. This panel will explore the online hate threat landscape. It will look at anti-Semitism on mainstream as well as on alternative platforms, offering insights into the types of anti-Semitism manifested online and the scope of the challenge. Our experts will share best practices on real-time monitoring and threat assessment. It is now my privilege to welcome Ifat Barak Cheney, Director of International Affairs at the World Jewish Congress, Ariel Seidler, Director of the Observatorio Web, which sits under the roof of the Latin American Jewish Congress. Unfortunately, Dave Rich, Director of Policy at Community Security Trust, fell sick, but will be replaced by my wonderful colleague Jakob Buhl, Policy and Research Manager at ISD's London office. Each of them will speak for about 7 minutes. We will have time for questions afterwards. Please post them in the chat. Allow me to make just a few very short introductory remarks. The digital space has long been a vehicle for anti-Semitism, especially in the European context. Even before the pandemic accelerated anti-Semitic conspiracy narratives, a survey by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union found that among European Jewish respondents, 89% considered online anti-Semitism to be a problem in their country. This was 2018. In a recent comparative study, the ISD examined how online anti-Semitism developed in Germany and France between 2021. The results are unfortunately utterly disturbing. In France, it has increased 7-fold. In my own country, Germany, it increased 13-fold. Anti-Semitism is being normalized at scale in a totally unseen way since the Holocaust. Jewish organizations have repeatedly warned against anti-Semitic online radicalization, and we are glad and grateful that we can help raise the issue higher on the political agenda. So there's much to do and much to discuss. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, Ifat Barak Cheney. As mentioned, Ifat is the World Jewish Congress Director of International Affairs and Deputy Director of the WJC Diplomatic Corps. Over to you, Ifat.
Thank you. Hello from New York. Good morning here. So first, let me congratulate our partners at UNESCO and Neighbors International and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue on the publication of this tool. It's an important and useful base for both those already involved in working against online hate and anti-Semitism and those wishing to get more involved in work in this area, which is greatly needed. So congratulations. And thank you for inviting me to speak today, representing the World Jewish Congress and our Jewish community affiliates worldwide. I'll keep my remarks short now, hopefully not 7 minutes, and try to just outline some issues that we see with anti-Semitism on the internet from our work and from our communities. So I want to give short comments just to frame the discussion on my end. So one is that while anti-Semitism online is discussed a lot under the hate speech concept, it also crosses other issues like calls for violence and terrorism, harassment and bullying that we see, disinformation, misinformation, and many more. So it's a challenge because it crosses a lot of different types of regulations and moderation, but it's also an opportunity to look at anti-Semitism more holistically and to deal with whatever tool we can use. The second is that anti-Semitism online, and this is mentioned in the toolkit, goes well beyond social media platforms. blogs, websites, search engines, gaming, live streaming videos, podcasts. So we tend to a lot of times kind of fall into discussing social media aspects in regulation, but we really must not lose sight of other venues and their regulation as well. And then lastly, I always say this, but while it's popular to speak and we're speaking about online hate, this is hate that exists offline. It's promoted in real life. It has real life consequences for people, and we must not forget that when we look at the issues. So with that said, I want to give an example that was flagged to me last week from one of our members. And it's a short quote I'll give you from a series of tweets from Lisa F15021. And the quote goes, "The Jewish-controlled system has been working to enforce the populace into being microchips." End quote. So this was reported by a user, and here's a short quote from the response. The quote goes, "After reviewing the available information, we want to let you know Lisa F15021 hasn't broken our safety policies. We know this isn't the answer you're looking for." End quote. So what are we looking for? What can we learn from this very simple example? And this is literally just a quote from something flagged to me last week. One, the history and the ever-evolving mutation of anti-Semitism, right? The internet moves fast, but it seems like anti-Semites just move faster. And this needs to be recognized. You can see this here in this example. It actually has two conspiracies to instill fear of Jews, right? Claiming that there is a Jewish-controlled system and that there is a conspiracy to microchip people. So these conspiracies will evolve with time. I'm sure there were no microchips decades ago, but the idea of the conspiracies and Jews' involvement in them was always there. There's another thing in this quote that you can't see by me reading it, but there's a simple use of language change that avoids detection and moderation. So the user spelled Jewish purposely as Joowish. She also used other deliberate misspelling of Jew and Jewish in the series of tweets she made. And this is happening all the time. It makes it harder for detection. It makes it harder for content moderators to pick up on it because there are plenty of them all over the world and they don't have a lot of time to think about these issues. And even more, use of names and proxies and symbols and photos to represent Jews is extremely common. Many proxies for Jews are not considered hate speech at all because they're not considered to be per se against Jews. I'm giving examples like the Rothschilds, the Soros family, and others, but also just simple misspelling like that just lives off online because it's not considered anti-Semitism and hate speech. And then the great response, we know this isn't the answer you're looking for. So this automatic response of moderation and the lack of tools to explain and appeal and flag further is really frustrating. So machine learning and AI seem to improve a lot, according to companies' own transparency records, honestly, but there's still a lot of reliance on reporting. And that's just a mixed bag because it often ends up with very frustrated users, right? Reporting rarely results in removal, either because it doesn't fall within policies of companies or there's a lack of understanding of context by content moderators. And then the users get this response and don't know what to do with it and don't have anything to do with it in many cases. So those are just few examples from one sentence that we saw online in the past weeks. What else are we seeing? I see at least a growing gap between this universality and internationality of companies and how they deal with issues such as hate speech and the need to have greater local understanding of context and players and languages, especially content moderation and just online tools are mainly in English language. They rarely exist in other languages and they do not exist in many smaller languages or less spoken languages. So. There's also still a lack of understanding of how two big areas influence anti-Semitism greatly. One is Holocaust denial distortion, and the second is the connection between Israel and Zionism ideology and anti-Semitism and the crossover between those. Also, acknowledging that global events and local events really unleash a rise of anti-Semitism and Jews are scapegoated for local events, things related to World War II, for example, just we had this week, but also discussions around things that are not related at all, like the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The local Jewish communities suffered a lot of anti-Semitism around it, these events. And then, of course, when issues do relate to Israel, Jewish communities always suffer, and online anti-Semitism flourishes during that time. A couple last things. We just see a lack of enforcement of existing policies, and I'll leave it there because there's a lot to say about that. And then there are many, many platforms that just don't have policies on these issues at all and are safe havens for anti-Semitic hate. We see anti-Semitism thriving on alternative platforms. These platforms avoid scrutiny or regulation because of their size or how they are defined. Right? Telegram is still a messaging app. And frankly, it seems also like many actors, including governments, have given up on moderating these platforms at all. Kind of, they're unreachable. We can't talk to them. We can't regulate them. And so basically, we're giving up on working on these platforms. So to finish my opening remarks, I'll repeat that while anti-Semitism mutates, the underlying concepts and ideas of anti-Semitism are the same. And the spread of anti-Semitism by any means possible is always also not new. And it's always been used, all possible means to spread the message. So we really have to focus on the flourishing of the development of online services and how that has influenced our anti-Semitism. I'll finish here and I look forward to discussion later.
Eva, thank you so much for your excellent input. A little bit of hope from Europe, probably because the Digital Services Act is really trying to bring about some changes platform-wise. Let me pass over to Ariel Seidler, who's currently the program director at the Latin American Jewish Congress, responsible for the Observatorio Web, a project designed to fight online hate and promote the responsible use of technologies. The floor is yours, Ariel. Please stick to 7 minutes if possible.
I will try. Thank you very much for the introduction and congratulations for all the work that UNESCO and the material that you are presenting. It's really amazing. I'm talking to you from Argentina, Buenos Aires, with a different perspective in some issues and other no. So let me share my screen and I will try to share with you some thoughts and to give you a couple of views from this part of the world. So the first thing, I'm working in this issue for the last 15 years. And since then, I have been reading all the time in the newspaper, on internet, different stuff that says that there is a rise of anti-Semitism attack. It happened when Mel Gibson's movie started, different analysis on CNN in 2009, and continue the rise of anti-Semitism in different newspapers. When the COVID quarantine started, there were also a lot of people saying the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism attack. And also the White House and the European Commission talk about this issue. In German, the community said a couple of years ago that it is really difficult for Jews to use the kippah in public, and they are suffering attacks on the street. And if we are seeing also Europe, as Ifat mentioned, there was the connection and the terrorist attack in Bulgaria, on Toulouse, in France, in the door of the school, the Brussels Museum, on Paris, the supermarket kosher outside of Paris after Charlie Hebdo attack, Pittsburgh, and Halle in Germany. All of this is not the situation for Latin America. When I talk with the Jewish community all over Latin America, and I ask them what is going on in their country, what is the main issue, anti-Semitic issue that you are suffering, it's difficult for them to explain which is. And comparing to all of this, the situation is completely different. The case is, in general, there are no physical attacks on the street, And we are seeing on internet more or less what all the people are seeing, but it's not something that goes to the public, and the public opinion is more anti-Semitic in their expression. We run different researches, and from the last 10 years, in most of the Latin American countries, they have a better understanding of what the Jewish life is, and no anti-Semitic thoughts on this by themselves. So my first message for all of you is anti-Semitism is different in each place, so we need different strategies to combat it. The second is what have is the last anti-Semitic ideas that were spread. If I talk about this, during the COVID-19, there was different messages online, like the Jewish were the ones who get benefit from the vaccines, or were disseminating the virus, related to also about the vaccination to the Holocaust. The Protocol of Elders of Zion has the new way now, the new world order. All the Jewish are getting advantage of this new type of government. And also in the last conflict that is still of Ukraine and Russia, the Jewish are getting the benefit of the conflict. All Russia is Nazi. It's somehow the flag, and giving and comparing Putin to Hitler. So if I'd more or less mention that, Mark Twain said, history never repeats itself, but it doesn't rhyme. So anti-Semitism is more or less the same, has new ways, and there are a lot of people that are trying to promote it with what is going on in the present, but in the essence is the same. We did a lot of research about it, and we published a couple of weeks ago our analysis on online anti-Semitism online of the last year. This is all the material that we analyzed in Spanish. This is the 11% is the average of anti-Semitic comments that we find in the media, in the website of the media in all this country. Uruguay, Chile, and Panama, there are top in those countries. Where is all that content? More or less 65% is in articles about Israel. When we analyze Twitter and all the content that we collect during the year, almost 40% of the content was in the conflict on May of 2021. As you can see the line. When we analyze the anti-Semitic content during the years, it's more or less stable in Spanish, about 89%. But as you can see in the last bar, when it's the conflict last year, it was more than double at that point. And on Facebook, the same situation. Half of the content that we collect all the year was during the conflict of last year. And when we analyze and we did the word cloud about the general situation that you can see on the left, and the word cloud on anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic content on Facebook and on Twitter. As Ifat mentioned, there is new ways to skip the moderation. The use not of Israel as a word, as Zionist, or different, this is in Spanish, but a good way to understand how they are doing is trying to analyze what content they are using with this type of techniques. So my another message is, today anti-Semitism is related to Israel. 83% of all the anti-Semitic content that we find last year was related to Israel. And to understand anti-Semitism, we need to measure it. I heard a lot of people talking about anti-Semitism and about the perception about it, but when you analyze, you have the information, you can find better ways to find solutions, to work with the companies to improve the situation. Three last concerns, trying to be in my 7 minutes. Internet is global. One of our major concerns is not to import the problems that are in other parts of the world. Another situation is the migration to platforms without moderation. There are new platforms that they are not moderating, and people that want to share all these nasty things jump from the more common platforms such Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to those platforms, and they are recruiting people from these platforms to the other platforms, Telegram also, and all the internet world is starting the discussion about the use of artificial intelligence and what Facebook is going to the metaverso. So this is something that is also a big issue and a big concern to us, how to deal with it, how to moderate, how to try to understand how all these people are going to use all these new ways, and what shall we do in all these cases. By the end, of course, education for all the people and to respect all religion and all the concerns, all the situation about each people is our goal and the best way to combat it. So thank you very much.
Ariel, thank you so much for these fascinating insights from Latin America, which are so important as research tends to be focused on Europe and on the US or North America, mostly at least. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Jakob Buhl. Jakob is the author of several ISD reports on the far right, international as well as in Germany. One of them is called Crisis and Loss of Control, Digital Extremism in the Context of COVID-19, or another one, Hosting the Holo Hoax, a snapshot of Holocaust denial across social media. And A Safe Space to Hate is another one, and that deals with Telegram. Jakob, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'll be trying to share my screen. I hope you can see this.
Yeah.
Very good. I'll use my 7 minutes to really talk about two aspects of the threat of anti-Semitism online. First off, just how I view this, what are some of the key trends that we've been monitoring at the Institute. And then secondly, I'll try to share some of the approaches that we're taking to keep track of the ongoing evolution of anti-Semitism online. So some of the key trends, and I'll split this up into the kind of scope and nature, into the platforms that we're monitoring, as well as into some of the actors and codes that we're seeing. Anti-Semitism is becoming increasingly visible over the past years. I mean, it was already mentioned, there's the survey by the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, which found that 88% of Jews across various European countries feel that the problem of online anti-Semitism has gotten worse over the past years. We've seen studies from Germany who've looked at anti-Semitism online, who see that it's not just an increase in the volume, but it's also a radicalization of anti-Semitic discourse. We find in studies that have just been published in this edited volume here in the middle, Anti-Semitism on Social Media, Günther Jekeli and his team have looked at tweets mentioning Jews, Israel, and Zionism, and have found that about 10%, a very high number, is likely anti-Semitic. Sometimes it's difficult to tell because of the lack of context. And in some of our own research at the Institute, my colleagues have found that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a massive increase, 7 times in French channels, 13-fold increase in the use of anti-Semitic keywords in far-right communities on Facebook and on Telegram. And this manifests, of course, as has been pointed towards already, both in people blaming Jews for the breakout of COVID-19 or presenting Jews as the profiteers of the crisis, but it also manifests in a trivialization of the Holocaust. often with protesters against COVID-19 measures, comparing these to the measures introduced by the Nazis, or by equating the vaccination program with the final solution. And anti-Semitism online, unfortunately, isn't just a problem that we find on a couple platforms. It is very easy to find anti-Semitic content really across most social media platforms, across websites, across blogs, across podcasts, which is still a little bit under-researched. But it's both the big platforms, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, increasingly an emerging platform that's incredibly popular among younger people. And it is a massive issue on the so-called all-tech platforms, these smaller platforms that are either unwilling to moderate anti-Semitic content or for technological capacity reasons not able to do so. And the reason that that social media has become such a crucial vector for anti-Semitic narratives, it depends a bit on the platform, but I mean, there's a few reoccurring reasons for this. And I think it's around platform policies. Often platforms rely on very narrow definitions of anti-Semitism, purely based around hate speech, not really taking into account the element of conspiracy theories, until quite recently not identifying Holocaust denial as a form of anti-Semitic conspiracy, merely thinking of it as a kind of historical debate. There's an issue around the moderation. So we know from the research from the Center for Countering Digital Hate that over 80% of the anti-Semitic content that they flagged in a kind of trial study was not removed, even when it was fairly straightforward. And beyond the enforcement and the narrow policies, it is also an issue of systems, of what kind of content is being amplified. And the ad-based model of especially the major social media companies, which are trying to maximize our attention, keep us hooked to the platforms, have found that this works especially well when it's sensationalist, emotionalizing content that's being amplified. And therefore, social media companies' business model has also inadvertently contributed to the amplification of anti-Semitic narratives online. But even when the algorithms aren't the key issue, which on Telegram, on 4chan, on Gab, it's really not the algorithm which is the main issue on these platforms. It's really just the kind of users that migrate there, often after being deplatformed from bigger platforms. We see entire subcultures emerging there that draw on long-standing anti-Semitic tropes, but that make references to broader youth culture, that create memes that are playing into certain visual and aesthetic styles, play into youth culture, make references to gaming culture online, and make them therefore trying to make anti-Semitic messages more approachable, more digestible, more appealing. In terms of the actors and codes, it is unfortunately a fact that anti-Semitism really unites different extremist and fringe movements across the political spectrum. It's not only hugely common among extreme right communities. We see quite a lot of anti-Semitic discourse in both the traditional Islamist extremist organizations, but also younger generations of Salafis or Islamist extremists that are drawing on some of the aesthetic that's been pioneered by the far right online. We find anti-Semitic narratives play a huge role among conspiracy theory communities, especially in the context of COVID-19, and also among far left communities online, where anti-Semitism is maybe relatively low in volume, but is often not called out, and where there is just not quite the challenge to anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic ways of describing Israel as we would probably like to hope. Anti-Semitism online, though, isn't just an issue of kind of fringe political movements. We know from polling, of course, online from surveys that anti-Semitism is present in much wider segments of the population. Anti-Semitic ideas find support in wider segments of the population. And so it's not surprising that even online we find anti-Semitic discussions around sports discussions and in entertainment as well, in hip-hop, for example. And what really social media and different platforms do, and especially those that have built online subcultures, is they facilitate a constant evolution of anti-Semitic codes, of dog whistles, of jokes, of memes. that even though they're drawing on ideas that are old, I very much agree with Ifat and Ariel that these aren't new ideas. It is really almost always drawing on old anti-Semitic tropes that are being repurposed, repackaged in a new optic. But it is very difficult to keep track of them because these anti-Semitic codes aren't always straightforward. They maintain plausible deniability. People can always say this isn't quite what we meant. They can reach broader audiences, and they can really avoid moderation efforts through these kind of always evolving codes. So what do we do about this? I mean, just in terms of the research, and I will come to a close in just a minute. I mean, I think we need the big data research. We need to be able to get as much data from the social media companies and even scrape websites and so on as we're able to do, to be able to say, how has this been developing quantitatively over time? Have conspiracy theories like QAnon really been on the rise? Has Holocaust denial been on the rise? So it's really one pillar that we try to focus on at ISD, get the quantitative picture, but then complement it with more qualitative research where you kind of embed yourself in some of these communities, try to follow the discussions, try to follow some of the codes. So you get the references, you get the memes, you get the new jokes, and can therefore complement the qualitative picture that we're getting from the big data analysis. And then lastly, a kind of third pillar of what we're trying to do to combat this through research is to essentially follow some of the infrastructure trail, to do some open source intelligence analysis, to do open source social media analysis, and to do research into the attribution, into the funding mechanisms, into the web infrastructure, to identify coordination, and especially go after some of the funding mechanisms that groups use to finance their activism. And with that, I will close my presentation, and I'm looking very much forward to the discussion now.
Thank you, Jakob. If only we had time. We only have, I think, 1 more minute. And I doubt that any question can be answered within a minute, but I'd like to file a question that Dan Shevet posted. And that is, have you interviewed anti-Semites in order to understand where it comes from? Do we have stats and demographics, not just country-based growth numbers, but more granular segmentation? Who would like to try to answer these two questions? Maybe the second one could go to Jakob, as we have certainly some data around that.
So it will depend a little bit per country. We didn't run specific polling for this toolkit, but there are many organizations that have internationally run surveys on anti-Semitic attitudes and have tried to find correlates between them, have to kind of try to find out, is there more anti-Semitism among people who support conspiracy theories, among supporters of far-right parties, among Muslim communities. It's a little bit difficult to make like blanket statements about this, but there are many organizations internationally that have done polling about this. And so I would just recommend to look out for some of the surveys that have been done internationally for the country context that the questioners would be interested in.
Maybe I can flag quickly, just here's an issue that we have a problem with. Data is very hard to get in a lot of these platforms. It's not forthcoming. It's not transparent. It's very hard to have research tools. Sometimes, organizations put a lot of money into programs and tools for this. So actually doing a lot of data analysis is difficult, and it's one place where regulation and the companies can really pitch in and make it easier.
Very, very true. I hope we do have time to go a little bit deeper into these questions on our second panel, to get to an answer where we are able to respond in a more timely and proportionate manner to the online threat that is ever evolving, unfortunately. And with that, thank you very much, all three of you, for your excellent input. And I'll hand over to Carol again. Thank you.
Thank you. Big thank you to Herberta and all of our panelists for outlining very clearly and quite precisely the current threat and harm posed by anti-Semitism online. Thanks a lot. I am now very, very pleased to welcome Alina Brickman, who's the initiator of this whole project and guide. Thank you, Alina, again for this. Alina is the director of European Union Affairs at the Neighborhood International. She will moderate the second panel on emerging responses to online anti-Semitism and hate speech. Alina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karel, for that kind introduction. And if I may ask the panelists on the second panel to turn on their video and show themselves to us. Welcome and thank you very much for agreeing to share your insights with us on this second panel today. Over the next about 40 minutes or so, we'll be looking together at emerging responses to online anti-Semitism. I am extremely pleased to be joined by Sophie Eliseon, head of the Interministerial Delegation for the Fight Against Racism, Anti-Semitism, and Anti-LGBT Hatred, or DILCRA, in France. Rachel Pollack, Associate Program Specialist on Communications and Information at UNESCO. And last but certainly not least, Grégoire Borst, full professor of developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience of education, and as well director of the Laboratory of Child Development and Education Psychology. Amongst the three of you, you bring really a depth of expertise from different fields, and thus will benefit today from really quite a cross-sectoral reflection, I'm sure. Similar to the first panel, we'll first hear from each speaker, and you are welcome to post questions in the chat, which I hope will indeed have a chance to address at the end. Panelists in the first panel laid out more or less the landscape of what we're seeing today online, where anti-Semitism is found, how it tends to affect communities, how it leads to repercussions in the offline world, and as well, what are some of the technical challenges? We already heard a little bit of potential responses, especially on the more technical side. And now we'll get to have a bit of inspiration looking at approaches to actually address the issue. By way of background, perhaps, especially in a European Union context, laws criminalizing anti-Semitic hate speech are in place across member states. But indeed, the enforcement of these laws has been extremely limited in the online space, even in the case of illegal speech. The pervasiveness of harmful but legal content, or what is sometimes referred to as lawful but awful speech, can often pose an even greater challenge, and thus it has really accelerated the need to look beyond the content-based approach towards more systemic solutions. So to put it simple, we're moving from asking, how do we remove this anti-Semitic post, to asking, what in the way that platforms are set up has enabled the spread of hate to hundreds and thousands of users, and how can we address that problem in a comprehensive way? At B'nai B'rith, we've looked to bring a Jewish perspective to this wider European debate about our digital public space. We've pulled together major Jewish organizations to offer a joint policy position in the lead up to the EU's new Digital Services Act, which was briefly mentioned. And you can read an analysis of the DSA in the toolkit. We've provided input for the EU's strategy on combating anti-Semitism to really emphasize the need for a strong digital pillar. And not least of all, of course, we've proposed today's toolkit developed in partnership with ISD and UNESCO. I think that creative and diverse responses are very much needed in this space, and so we have much to discuss with our guests today. Sophie Eliseon, I cannot see you. I see you now. Perfect. Like I mentioned, you lead the DILCRA, France's body in charge of the fight against racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-LGBT hatred. I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about how anti-Semitism online figures in your broader DILCRA work, how you are dealing with this from a governmental perspective, and also perhaps looking specifically at the French context. We'd love to hear your take on how digital legislation in France, which is also addressed in the toolkit as a case study, has been or not effective in dealing with hate online.
Thank you. The French government, as you said, is committed to fight against anti-Semitism and more generally against online hate throughout education, laws, and support to NGOs. Education and the fight against the spread of hate speeches on the internet are among the priority projects of the government. This morning, I have opened 2 meetings on the subject. The first one is a workshop on combating online speeches in video games with the participation of video game unions, publishers, social networks, associations, and innovative digital actors. The second one is a 2-day seminar for teachers on how to fight against racism and anti-Semitism in school. About the law, thanks to the Avia law, a digital prosecutor's office with magistrates specialized in digital issues was created in 2020, as well as the Observatory of Online Hate that is headed by the Audiovisual and Digital Communication Regulatory Authority, called ARCOM, has been created too. The bill to strengthen respect for the principles of Republic was passed in August 2021. It contains about 10 articles dedicated to the fight against online hate. I want to focus on 3 of them. The first one, the creation of an offense of endangering the life of others by disseminating information relating to private, family, or professional life. The second one is the immediate appearance that may now be mobilized in certain cases of abuse of freedom of expression. And the third one is a new moderation regime for online content that forces platforms to implement a certain numbers of measures in a transparent manner, accessible to general public, and to report the outcome that will be able to take financial actions. And more recently, a European-level legislation was conducted under the French presidency of the EU, in which the DILCRA has largely participated, the Digital Services Act, DSA. It aims to provide an harmonized framework rules of online services, mainly in terms of moderation of illegal content and transparency of service in order to regulate the internet and make it a safer place for users. As a kind of conclusion, I want to focus on our daily work and our support for NGOs on different actions. Monitoring, reporting to Pharos, to platforms, and to the public prosecutor when necessary is one of the DILCRA's tasks. We are also committed in a close and constant collaboration with civil society throughout associations, memorial sites, but also with social medias in order to progress on these issues. And of course, we support and finance educational projects in schools to empower young people in their understanding and response to online hatred, harassment, and disinformation. For example, we work with associations such as e-Enfance, Génération Numérique, or Civic Fab. The proactive search for new partnerships to fight against online hate is also one of our tasks. And the development of projects in collaboration with civil society and now with private companies also facing these issues. The fight against anti-Semitism and online hate is everyone's business. Beyond the governmental work that has been done and that remains to be done in this area, this is a real challenge concerning the application of citizenship and civism in the digital sphere, and that is the responsibility of all of us. It is up to each and everyone to be a cyber guardian of our values. It is necessary to adapt new online civil habits, to react, to report, to protect. The project we are leading on the mobilization of video games for online citizenship will aim to promote the solutions at the disposal of users when they are dealing with online hate.
Thank you very much, Sophia Lizaon. And one important thing I take away is the partnership with really a lot of partners across civil society, trying to access a lot of new segments of the population. Moving now to Rachel Pollack, let me come to you. As I noted, you are working as Associate Program Specialist on Communications and Information at UNESCO. You've been a freedom of expression expert at UNESCO for over a decade. So I think it would just generally be very informative to learn a bit more about UNESCO's overall approach to address hate speech, and perhaps how this line of your work interacts with countering anti-Semitism more specifically.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Alina. And this has been such a fascinating discussion so far. So as Alina said, I'll just speak more generally about UNESCO's approach to hate speech, which falls within the framework of the United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, which was declared by the UN Secretary General in 2019. So the UNESCO plan focuses on hate speech from multiple perspectives, both educational approaches and also actions to protect and respect the right to freedom of expression. I see there's been some discussion in the chat, and I noted that the book, unfortunately, the talk is, I think, in New York and very late Paris time, but I've downloaded the book for future reading. So the UNESCO approach is guided by three key principles, the three R's, we say, which is respect for human rights, strengthening resilience and capacity to better respond, and investing in more research, knowledge, and data for better decision making. And we're looking also at the role of digital tools and internet companies in addressing hate speech and responding to new evolving challenges, including the COVID-19 crisis. So UNESCO's Assistant Director General Giannini spoke about UNESCO's work to counter anti-Semitism and to address hate speech in and through education. I'll give the perspective of the communication and information sector, which works for the protection and respect of the right to freedom of expression and access to information. So when looking at countering these issues, we have to consider that the human rights dimensions are not in opposition, that actually, as again has been mentioned in the chat, a very powerful way to counter hate speech is through supporting professional media, independent media in their reporting about hate speech and to ensure that they are not used instrumentally to actually transmit hate speech. So UNESCO has done a lot of work in this area through promoting media and information literacy, to strengthening independent media, and also for advocating for greater transparency from the tech companies, another theme that's come up in today's event. We recently partnered with the Oxford Internet Institute with support from the European Union to look at monitoring online hate speech, especially in multilingual environments. We published a discussion paper last October on addressing hate speech on social media, contemporary challenges. The full report will be published later this year. And I'd like to focus on just a few key areas of recommendations from this forthcoming report that are related to the online platforms. So the first area is transparency. And as has been mentioned, in order to effectively address and counter hate speech, tech companies need to improve their transparency policies and practices. And what would such transparency entail? We've identified 4 areas. So first, companies should proactively release data about hate speech complaints and their resolution, their content moderation policies, and the accuracy and functioning of their content moderation systems. And this is especially for independent researchers. Companies should also extend their transparency policies to include issues related to the algorithms underpinning the mechanisms of the platforms. And they should disclose if the algorithms, if the companies are looking at the application of the algorithms in especially sensitive contexts, such as during elections. The company should also collect and share disaggregated data, which is something else that was asked in today's discussion, to understand who is posting this content, how it's being spread. As one of the speakers mentioned, to understand anti-Semitism, we need to measure it. I think as Jacob also said, looking at whether Holocaust denial and distortion has been on the rise, we need to have a quantitative picture of what's going on and then complemented by qualitative research. And then finally, companies should be transparent about whether they conduct human rights impact assessments and the impact of any changes in their content curation or moderation policies. And they should release such data publicly, especially in specifically conflict-prone environments and other sensitive contexts. These recommendations are in line with UNESCO's 26 high-level principles on enhancing the transparency of internet platform companies. These principles span across issues related to content and process, to due diligence and redress, user empowerment, commercial dimensions, personal data gathering and use, and data access. So this is really a priority for UNESCO of asking for more transparency from the companies. This year, we're also doing consultations within the framework of the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. It's the 10-year anniversary of that. And so we want to understand, for the protection of journalists, what kind of data is needed from the companies at a very technical level, and what is realistic for them to share. Among the recommendations from our study is also that digital platform companies should improve their content moderation practices and also their appeal systems. And so we need sufficient human content moderation across languages around the world with relevant cultural and contextual knowledge. We need robust and time-sensitive options for appeal and remedy. And also to think about the mental health toll of human moderators and looking at this content. And then it's important also that tech companies partner with civil society organizations and independent researchers to ensure that their policies and practices are aligned with community needs. CSOs can also help companies in developing early warning systems on trends in hate speech, especially in environments marked by division and conflict. CSOs can also be mobilized to advocate for better and inclusive policies and monitoring. And companies can partner with educational institutions, as well as institutions such as UNESCO, in directing users towards authoritative content, such as UNESCO's partnership with Meta and TikTok towards the Holocaust education website. So based on these recommendations, and our work has continued to focus on building the capacity of journalists, of educational institutes, of civil society organizations. We have a project now called Social Media for Peace, which is being implemented in 4 countries, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Indonesia, Kenya, and Colombia. And it works to counter the harm of potentially harmful content like hate speech, while at the same time fostering peace and respecting freedom of expression. We also work to promote media and information literacy. We lead the Global Alliance for Partnerships in Media and Information Literacy and develop curricula on this. We lead workshops. Very interesting work that was mentioned by the previous speaker about working with the video game community. I think that's another area we've started to look into, and I think could do much more. So I'll stop there. Many interesting programs happening at UNESCO, and looking forward to hearing the other interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that excellent and extremely comprehensive presentation. I think we often look for a easy solution, but I think the 26-point action plan tells us that unfortunately that's not the case, and we really need to have an extremely multifaceted approach to the issue at hand. And I think Gregoire will only add to the sort of directions from which we're coming to the problem from. As I had noted, Gregoire Borst is full professor of developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience of education at the University of Paris. You are also the director of the Laboratory for the Study of Child Development and Education, and the senior fellow of the International Bureau of Education of UNESCO itself. So I suspect you have quite a unique take on our conversation today. Your work focuses on the role of cognitive and emotional control on the cognitive and social emotional development of children and adolescents. I'm sure you will bring more light into what that means in practice. But I'd love to hear your take on how education can actually build resilience and promote the emotional skills of young people in particular and their competencies to thrive in this quite challenging reality that they're exposed to more than any other social category.
Okay, thanks a lot for your invitation. I'll try to share my screen because I wanted to show you a bit of the work we've been doing in the lab. And if that works, it should work. Okay, so I'm going to take a bit of a different approach and look at basically the issue of the brain that receives information and how this brain should be basically armed to a certain extent or foster with enough skills in order to basically distinguish between facts and opinions and between basically false information and real information. And you will see that this is quite important because basically the way you're going to process information, the way you're going to engage in media truth discernment will have a direct effect on your propensity to adhere to a conspiracy theory. So we are trying to work on this in the lab, like for the last 2 or 3 years. It's interesting because there is no much data on adolescents from this perspective. There is a lot of data on how they consummation of digital media and so forth and so on, but not much on the type of skills they need to be able to engage in critical thinking regarding information. This is one of the key here, is like to see what could be the type of skills that we need to foster in adolescents in order for them to become adults that can basically have enough skills to be able to discern between true and false information. Okay, so the issue is that we know that trust in the media is very low, and this is across countries a big issue, is that the response cannot be just on the media part. So you can increase basically the way media will process information, the way they will have like a number of steps to verify information, and so forth and so on. But if the public doesn't trust the media, then it's a lose game basically, and this means that we need to think of other solutions. I'm not saying that this is not something we should like continue to pursue, but I'm just saying that this cannot be the only solution. And so this is like basically a study that's been done by Ipsos that showed that if you look, for instance, in France or Germany, this is the more negative you are, the less trust you have in the media. And if you look for newspaper and magazine, the trust is very low. Same thing for television and radio, online news, website and platform. And which is a bit scary is that people actually trust the people they know in real life. So you can understand how basically you can create echo chambers in which people will only engage with people they know and with whom they share some type of values and some type of common views on the world. So this is something we need to work on from an educational perspective and to see what we can bring to the table. The second issue is that people are overconfident in their ability to do media truth discernment. This another study done by Ipsos where they looked at respondents from 16 to 64 years of age. And you can see that 65% of respondents think that other people live in their own echo chambers, but only 34 think that they do. And this is basically overconfidence. So we misevaluate our ability to basically engage in an objective processing of information. Same thing, 63% think they could identify fake news, but only 41% think that the average person is able to do so. 60% of respondents think that the other are not interested in facts, but only in what they want to believe. But that's actually the case for each and every one of us. And that's the big, basically, the big response that we have. And the thing that we've been studying in psychology for long is that we're all biased, basically. The key here is to know that you're biased and that from time to time, in some context, you won't be able basically to go against your first response. And the big issue is how are you able to engage in these cases in self-control? So how will you be able basically to say, well, here I am actually biased, and I should take a little bit sidestep on the situation and try to see the big picture, please. We know this is quite important for media truth discernment, and there's been like quite a number of studies now showing that actually your ability to reason logically in context in which most of the people are biased. So basically, the classical question is from the cognitive reflection test. If I ask you, a ball and a bat cost 12 euros in total, the bat costs 10 euros more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Most of you will say 2. And after deliberate thinking, you will realize that actually the correct answer is 1. And so if you test the general population, the interesting thing is that people who are the best to engage in critical thinking and logical reasoning in those type of situations are the ones who are the best to basically evaluate information despite their own opinion, political opinion, for instance. So this is the key here. This is like a first basically information, a critical information that we should be able to increase the ability of people to reason logically in context in which most of us are biased, because that's actually a critical skill to evaluate information. So we know also that most of the things we're doing at the moment are not quite working when we try to debunk people. We know, for instance, that the more you're going to present an information, the more people will think that this information is true. And this is called illusory truth effect. If you're familiarized with an information, you will tend to think that this information is more true than if you see it from the first time. So this is also speaks to the issue of how do we debunk information? How do we fight against conspiracy theory? Because the more you're going to present a conspiracy theory, the more you're going to be familiarized with it, the more you're going to be thinking that this actually theory might be true. So this is all the psychological process that we need to take into account when we think of how to best fight misinformation, but also conspiracy theory and hate speech basically across the media. We also know that adolescence is basically a window of vulnerability. It's a window of vulnerability because the brain is changing during adolescence. It will completely reconstruct, reconfigure during this time. And we also know that the specificity of adolescents, they are way more driven toward emotion. They have less emotional control and they tend to be more engaged in automatic processing than more reflective processes. So it's also a time of life where they can be engaged mostly in information that they feel are emotional, well, that are surprising or that are humorous. And the key here is how do we make sure that this adolescence comes in, like process information in such a way that they're at least aware of their biases, basically. And this is something that we don't do much, basically, in our educational system. At least I can talk from the French perspective, but in the French perspective, it's not something we do. We do a lot of classes about how to construct false information, but now how to process from the brain point of view the information. Okay, so we did a study that we replicate now in different countries, where we started to look basically of the ability of adolescents to basically distinguish between true and false information. And the task is very simple. You present an information and you have like a 4-point Likert scale, and you have to say whether this information is true or not so true on the 4-point scales, basically. And so if there is no difference between the ratings of the false and the true information, basically you're not able to distinguish between the two. We started in 10 years old, 11 years old children. Well, you know, most of them have already a smartphone, so they're already exposed to a lot of information. And if you can look at that at basically 10 years of age, they're not able to distinguish between true and false information. Okay, and during adolescence, they become better at distinguishing the two, even though we're still very bad at doing this. And we also show that illusory truth effect can be shown at all ages. So we also show that irrespective of the age, your ability to reason logically in the type of problems I show you are very much related to your ability to not only basically discern false and true information, but it's also very much related to your adherence to conspiracy theory. So basically the take-home message is that we need to work on improving the ability of children to reason logically in those type of contexts, because that's one way to allow them to be better at evaluating information, but also it's a way to decrease their adherence to conspiracy theory. And there's a number of things we're trying at the moment. One thing is to stop the spread of false information online. And there's been data showing that if you just shift the focus to the accuracy of the information before people engage in sharing the information, that could actually be a good way of reducing sharing of false information online. This was done in adults, and we just replicate the exact same result in adolescents. So it seems that even in adolescents, that could be actually a way to improve spreading of false information online. And the second idea is also to work on the social context. We know that adolescents are very much influenced by the social context. We know that when they're in group, they're worse at evaluation of information. But if you use the context in a different way, so if you say that other people will actually evaluate the type of information you share on the social media, then people tend to share less false information and less conspiracy theories. So we'll see that we can also play with the social context in a way to responsibilize globally adolescents for them not to share information online. And the last thing is to say, well, what we need to do also is to debias people in order to prevent conspiracy theory spreading. And that's some of the things we're trying in the lab at the moment. So we don't have the data yet, but that's one of the things we're trying, working with different private and public companies on these issues. So thanks a lot for your attention. And that's usually, there should be a picture of my lab, but I just usually I end up by thanking all the members of my lab, but thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gregoire. And we thank the members of your lab for very interesting psychological insights there, and really bringing a lot of new concepts to the discussion around critical thinking, echo chambers, this question of misevaluating one's own bias. In the couple of minutes that we have left, perhaps I'd like to push a little bit further on what Gregoire was speaking about, and see whether there are any kind of practical positive examples in the field of education of actually enabling more critical thinking, whether this is in a French context. Sophia Liseon, if there is an example of effectively dealing with critical thinking skills in schools, or perhaps Rachel, you would have a comment from UNESCO side that will also respond in part to Larry Holman's question about tackling misinformation through critical thinking education. So perhaps Rachel, if there is any background, we have Sophia Liseon, so please.
I'm sorry, I have trouble with my telephone. Can you repeat the question, please?
I was wondering whether there are any examples of best practices from France in educating young people in the area of critical thinking, whether building critical thinking skills has manifested itself in the educational system in France.
Sorry, yes, we have many examples, but I would like to focus on one of it. It's the work doing by the Association of Jewish Students with whom we are working in school, but also out of schools with young adults and teenagers. And for example, they are using the religious dates to make young adults and teenagers who are not Jews, who are not Jewish, to meet Jewish people. And for example, I went to the organization of an event called Sukkot Expliquer mes potes. I can translating it by explaining Sukkot to my friends. and we were invited by the rabbi and his wife in a Jewish school, and non-Jewish people were meeting the rabbi and his wife, and the rabbi explained what is Sukkot and what it means in the religion, and it was really an amazing event because the young adults and the teenager were really surprised by the way they were welcomed by the rabbi and his wife, and some of them said that, "Oh, I was wondering what was happening in the school when I walk on the front of its entrance, and I didn't think it was so." Friendly, in fact, with everybody. So I think it's a good way of explaining that we have many things in common, and it's a good way of combating anti-Semitism and stereotypes.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I think it's important to highlight these best practices coming from youth, and UGF does tremendous work in France. And also important to remember that dealing with prejudice in the offline space can too contribute to limiting the spread of anti-Semitism online. And perhaps as a closing, Rachel, if you'd also like to highlight any specific examples of best practices you've seen from the UNESCO space on this front of bringing critical thinking education to young people.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a really inspiring example about Sukkot. I would say, on media and information literacy, as I mentioned, UNESCO has a lot of work in this area. And we also have a campaign, maybe I can mention, called Mill Clicks, which is to foster critical thinking. And the idea there, which is, I think, really connected with Gregoire's presentation, is to ask people to think before they share and think before they click, and just to have that extra pause. And so this is something we're fostering, that, of course, on the receiving end of learners and people of all ages in media information literacy. And then also, as I had mentioned, in supporting the work of journalists and fact checkers, because that's so closely intertwined, the issues around hate speech and disinformation. So we try to look at a kind of multi-stakeholder approach of supporting the journalists and public service media. That was also brought up, educators, as well as individuals and how they interact in the online space. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to all three of you for a very insightful conversation. And I think our audience have a series of projects that they can look up after this program. And now I'll pass over to Carol to close us off.
Thanks very much, Alina, and thanks to all of our panelists for their extremely instructive interventions, which clearly highlighted the complexity of the issue at stake and the nature of the interventions which must be designed and implemented. Your efforts to counter anti-Semitism share in UNESCO's vision to promote effective policy, education and research to counter extremist ideologies and their hateful propaganda online. Civil society in this respect has an indispensable role to play in monitoring hate as it spreads across social media, and this should be supported by governments and social media companies to develop holistic and whole society responses. So, ladies and gentlemen, today's event gives us an opportunity to once again raise our voices against all forms of prejudice and to raise awareness about the real danger of hate speech on social media. I would like to thank B'nai B'rith International and the Institute of Strategic Dialogue for developing the Civil Society Toolkit in partnership with UNESCO, and to support civil society to develop robust and effective responses to anti-Semitism online. We encourage you to use this toolkit as a source of knowledge and guidance to foster joint cross-society solutions to this growing threat. UNESCO will continue to empower key actors to ensure that human rights and fundamental freedoms are guaranteed online and offline in line with international standards. We are clear that the responsibility to address anti-Semitism is a global one, and we are committed to working with civil society to fight it, to prevent it, and to eradicate it. Thank you for joining us.